The following was recorded by John Lothe and is intended for educational purposes. This recording is not to be sold or distributed for sale. If you wish to support the work and publishing of these recordings, please visit the John Lothe Patreon page. If you come across these recordings anywhere else without my expressed support, and find that they are requesting donations for presenting this work to you, you will not be supporting the creator by doing so. This is just a friendly warning to anyone who may fall prey to predatory practices I have come across recently. The Shape of Things to Come by H. G. Wells. Part 23. The Raid of the Germs. That same dearth of detailed description, which takes the color out of the history of the last wars, becomes even more apparent in the records of the epidemics that made any resumption of that warfare impossible. Diaries, letters, and descriptive writing were out of fashion. There were other things to do and no surplus energy in the brain. It is as if the microorganisms had taken a leaf out of the book of the Foreign Offices and found in mankind's confusion an opportunity for restoring the long-lost empire of the germs. The attack began in the best style without a declaration of war. The first line of advance consisted of a variety of influenzas, impoverishing fevers that were highly infectious and impossible to control under war conditions. The depleted strength of the belligerent populations, a depletion due to their reduced and disorganized nourishment, and the collapse of their sanitary services, gave these infections full scope. They killed some millions and diminished the already lowered vitality of the great populations still further. That lowering of the general vitality was far more important than the actual mortality. Cholera and bubonic plague followed. And then, 5 years and more later, when the worst seemed to have passed, came the culminating attack by maculated fever. This obscure disease, hitherto known only as a disease of captive baboons, seems to have undergone some abrupt adaptation to the kindred habitat of the human body. Possibly there was some immediate host which prepared the bacilli for their attack on mankind. Or it may be that the preceding epidemics had changed some hitherto defensive element in human blood. We are still quite in the dark upon these points, because at that time there were no doctors or biologists with the leisure to record observations, even had they had the time to make them, and scientific publications had ceased to appear anywhere. The disease appeared first in the vicinity of the London Zoological Gardens, and spread thence with incredible rapidity. It discolored the face and skin, produced a violent fever, cutaneous irritation, and extreme mental distress, causing an uncontrollable desire to wander. Then, the bodily energy vanished in collapse, and the victim lay down and died. The fever was not simply infectious through water, but transmitted by the almost impalpable scabs scratched off by the sufferer. Wind, water, and the demented sick carried it everywhere. About half humanity was vulnerable, and so far as we know now, all who were vulnerable took it, and all who took it died. So the world's malaise culminated in the terrible 18 months between May 1955 and November 1956, at which latter date nature, with a pitiless but antiseptic winter, came to the rescue of the human remnant. No effectual cure was ever devised for this fever, and no helpful palliative. It swept the whole world and vanished as enigmatically as it came. It is still a riddle for pathologists. It no longer affects even the surviving baboon population, so that investigators can make no cultures, nor attempt any experiments. There is no material. It came, it destroyed, and it seems to have at last committed suicide, with some unknown antibody of its production. Or the real disease, as Mackinson believes, may have not been the maculated fever at all, but the state of vulnerability to its infection. That vulnerability had spread unsuspected throughout the world, he thinks, in the Warring Forties. The actual pestilence was not the disease, but the harvest of a weakness already prepared. History is like the individual memory in this, that it tends to obliterate disagreeable experiences. One of the most nonsensical things that was ever said was that a country is happy that has no history. On the contrary, it is only the really secure and prosperous phases that have left anything like sufficient material for historical reconstruction. We know of the pleasant social life of all the centuries of abundance in Egypt. We know the greatness and conquests of Assyria. The court life of Ajanta in Central Asia is pictured for us to share. But the days of military disaster leave nothing but a band of ashes, and the years of pestilence merely break the continuities of the record. There is a good account of the Plague of London, 1665, written by Defoe, 1659 to 1731, and the unwary reader has to be warned that account was compiled and fabricated many years after the event by an ingenious writer who was not even an eyewitness. There is a painting by Raphael of the plague in Rome, which is similarly reminiscent. Most of the great plagues of history took their dead and departed unportrayed. What concerns history is the subsequent social and economic dislocation. On that, Clio becomes copious again. What goes on again matters to her, but what is dead is dead. The flowering prosperity of the 19th and early 20th centuries has left us an almost uncontrollable mass of record about people who knew nothing except by hearsay of the more frightful experiences of mankind. We have novels, letters, diaries, memoirs, pictures, photographs, and so on by the million. But there survives hardly a letter, no pictures, and not a book or newspaper to throw light on those years, 1955 and 1956, little more than a century and a third ago, which were certainly the most terrible through which our race ever passed. What was written at the time was destroyed as infectious. Afterwards, it was left for a new generation of Defoes and Stephen Cranes to contrive a picture. The descriptions of Cable, Nath Das, Bodesco, and Martini seem to be fairly justifiable, and to these fictions the reader is referred. They ring the changes upon not only villages, but towns and cities, with none but dead men and women in them, people lying unburied and gnawed by packs of hungry dogs and solitary cats. In India, the tigers, and in Africa, the lions came into the desolate streets, and in Brazil, the dead population of whole districts was eaten chiefly by wild hog, which multiplied excessively. Rats swarmed, and with an unwonted boldness threatened even the immune. One terror, which is never omitted, is the wandering of the infected. Nothing could keep them from entering towns and houses that were as yet immune. Thousands of these dying wanderers were shot by terror-stricken people whom they approached. That dreadful necessity horrifies us today, as much as the other grim act of self-protection. The survivors in the boats of the big steamship Titanic, which struck an iceberg in 1912, beating at the knuckles of the drowning men and women who clung to the sides and threatened to swamp them. For a while, under such desperate and revealing stresses, man ceased to obey the impulses of a social animal. Those of the population who resisted the infection, and with maculated fever the alternatives were immunity or death, gave way to a sort of despair and hatred against the filthy suffering around them. Only a few men with medical, military, priestly, or police training seem to have made head against the disaster and tried to maintain a sort of order. Many plundered. On the whole, So far as the evidence can be sifted, women behaved better than men, but some few women who joined the looters were terrible. This nightmare came and passed. In January 1957, people were walking about in the deserted towns, breaking into empty houses, returning to abandoned homes, exploring back streets littered with gnawed bones or fully clad skeletons, and they were still unable to realize that the wrath of nature was over and life still before them. Maculated fever had put gas warfare in its place. It had halved the population of the world. End of Part 23.